Hello everybody, and welcome to today's presentation, Bring Back the Unit Testing Love, JUnit Made Easy, brought to you by Parasoft. Before we get started, I'd like to take care of a couple of housekeeping items. First off, just want to make sure that everybody can hear me okay, so if you can, please post into the chat window that you can hear me the post. Great. If you have any questions for our presenters today, please be sure and post those into the questions panel so that we can get to them after the presentation. If you experience any technical difficulties, like the audio dropping out or the screen sharing not displaying properly, please post a message in the chat panel to me, the host, and I will work with you to resolve those issues. Lastly, on the housekeeping list, we are recording today's presentation and will be making it available through email shortly after. So now that we're through the housekeeping items, I'd like to go ahead and introduce you to our presenters today. First up, we have Mark Lambert. Mark is responsible for ensuring that Parasoft solutions deliver real value to the organizations adopting them. His team helps customers optimize their software development processes by assessing their specific development needs, then determining how to apply Parasoft technologies, processes, and methodologies to achieve their goals. Mark has been with Parasoft since 2004, working with a broad cross-section of their global 2,000 customers. His engagements have extended from specific technology implementations to broader SDLC process improvement initiatives. Mark has also been instrumental in designing solutions for numerous industry verticals, including safety-critical, medical device, and complex component-based architectures. Now, I'd like to do a quick sound check for Mark. So, Mark, if you'd like to say hello to our audience, and audience, please let me know if you can hear Mark by posting a message in the chat panel.
Thanks, Chris, and good morning, good afternoon, everybody.
Great. Next, we have Nathan Jakubiak, a project lead engineer for the Unit Test Assistant functionality within Parasoft JTest and the industry-leading API testing solution Parasoft SOA Test. Having been with Parasoft since 2000, he helped build SOA Test from the ground up and recently took responsibility for development of the Unit Test Assistant. He oversees the architecture of the products and leads multiple distributed development teams utilizing the Agile Scrum methodology. Nathan is passionate about building high-quality, well-architected software solutions with development processes that make sense. Now I'd like to do a quick sound check for Nathan. So Nathan, if you'd like to say hello, and audience, let me know if you can hear Nathan by posting in the chat panel.
Thanks, Chris. Hello, everybody.
Great. Looks like everybody can hear Nathan. Well, without any further ado, I'll go ahead and turn things over to Mark to begin the presentation. Mark?
Great. So, yeah, thanks, everybody, for joining today's webinar. We're really excited about the work that we've been doing around Java unit testing and really very excited to share that with you all today. Now, before I jump into talking about what the Unit Testing Assistant is and how the Unit Test Assistant can really simplify and streamline the unit testing process for JUnit test cases, it's worthwhile just touching upon kind of really the core piece around unit testing. And I want you to ask yourself a question. How do you really feel about unit testing? And this is an interesting one because I've been talking with folks for the last 6 to 12 months about the work we've been doing here, and often kind of the mental images that come to mind are kind of not particularly pleasurable. Either I'm going to be now have some kind of pain associated with the activity that's about to be performed, or I've got a backlog of stuff that I really should have addressed and just, quite frankly, haven't had the time to, and I've got that pile of bills that I know I'm going to have to go ahead and look at. Interestingly as well, as I've talked with folks at different conferences this year, a common phrase came up. I hate unit testing. The emotional context with, right, okay, I know I need to do unit testing, but it's really not what I want to get to. It's not my core function in life. I'm a developer. I want to develop code. Obviously, I want to deliver good code, but unit testing is just so complicated and takes so much time. So what we're going to do is we're going to actually start this with a little bit of interaction. I'm going to ask you a question. What's your current code coverage that you get from your unit testing practice? So let's go ahead and start the poll, Chris. And don't worry if you're be honest here. This will be really interesting for us to see from the point of view of the demographic of the audience that we've got today and see how that resonates with what we found when we go and talk to people. We do have the opportunity at Parasolve to talk to many different industries and many different scales and size of organizations around their testing practices. So this will be really interesting to see kind of where we sit. How are we looking, Chris?
Looks like we've got about 55% in right now. We'll give them just a couple more seconds here to get their answers in, and then we'll share the results.
Great. Now, also, I do not know is a valid question, a valid response. It is, not uncommon to find organizations or even individuals within an organization that have a practice in place that don't actually know what that overall coverage is.
All right, I think we've got just about everybody in, so I'll go ahead and close the poll now and share the results with everybody.
Wow, that's actually, okay, so whoever the 1% was who is web perfect, we're 100% right on. You guys are right in there. That's exactly the place to be. However, that is really the extreme, and this actually mirrors pretty closely with what I've seen before. I don't know, Nathan, would you agree?
Yeah, that's what I would expect.
Often, we would have added another couple of levels here, but kind of at a 20% level. But GoToWebinar only gives us 5 buckets. So often, I see a lot of people just a little above 20%, usually in that 20 to 40 bucket. So this is great information. Well, you know what? Good news, guys. We can obviously help with that, and that's the purpose of today's session. So let's go ahead and switch back to the presentation. There we go. Okay. Let me just get my mouse back. Okay, great. So let's kind of take this a little bit back to basics and just talk at a high level about the concept of the testing pyramid. For those that have read some of the blogs that we've been posting recently, you'll see this focus on the testing pyramid. Mark Fowler talks about this a lot from an agile perspective, and it's certainly something that we very strongly agree with at Parasolve. So the thing is that you're starting with a solid foundation of automated unit tests, being very shift-lefted, even though I think that term is a little bit overused these days. But being able to create those unit tests very early in the process, having them highly automated, and then focusing with a smaller number of manual tests at the top of the pyramid. Or automated UI tests that are typically more brittle and not as resilient to change in the underlying code. However, these two kind of edges or levels within the pyramid are often at odds with each other. We see that people want to do automated unit testing, but that it's really too hard to create them, so they often defer to later in the software development cycle, and most organizations end up with more of an ice cream cone than a pyramid. Now, the obvious thing, but often the dirty secret that many development organizations kind of hide to the senior management is that while we're doing the full testing at that later cycle or higher up in the pyramid, the problem is that we're finding many problems there because we're so far disconnected for when the problems were injected into the code base. However, you do need to leverage techniques from across the pyramid, and that's where we at Parasolve focus. We focus on helping organizations blend together these different testing techniques to maximize the return on investment, where the investment is your time. It's the time taken to create and maintain and manage the tests, and the return is obviously mitigating the business risk and ensuring that you have a quality system. We focus on helping organizations build a stable and continuous automated testing framework across the pyramid, and we merge together the data from each of these different layers to enable processes and workflow improvements like change-based testing with our reporting and analytics dashboard, DTP. But the focus for today is going to be around unit testing, focusing on the bottom of the pyramid. And there are 3 challenges obstacles, maybe some would call excuses, why we see that unit testing is not very well adopted within the industry. What I will say is that's not universal. Some organizations do have fantastic test suites, and they're very big test suites, but what we'll talk about here is some of the challenges as your testing suite grows in size as well. So the first thing is that unit testing is time-consuming, and that creating a good isolated unit test is actually complicated. Writing the appropriate code that you need to be able to create the mocks correctly, to make sure that you've done all of the wiring so you've got a nicely isolated code, just takes a lot of time. And it's time that could be otherwise spent doing development, or in our case, we argue that it's otherwise time that could be otherwise spent putting more value into the unit test itself and injecting more business logic to create more valuable tests. The second piece is often when you're looking at that below 40% bucket, which the majority of the audience was, and you know the do not I don't know is as I said before kind of an often a typical scenario as well. All you're doing right now is you're looking at that mountain of bills, that really messy teenager's bedroom, and going, okay, I've just got a lot to do. It's going to take me a lot of time. And what we're going to talk about here is how we can streamline that process, how we can help you create a broader test coverage, how you can get a jump start on the overall unit testing practice. And then the third piece, and this is the piece that is really a subtle one that most people don't come across yet. But as you start scaling your unit testing practice and you start having this wonderful test suite that's at 100%, you're going to find you're going to spend a lot of time trying to maintain that test suite. And certainly, as we've found when we work with clients who have those larger test suites, they spend a lot of time trying to identify why the test suite is unstable, or I'm making changes to the code and I need to now make changes to the tests, which obviously unit tests are code, so you should be refactoring them, but there's a bunch of other subtle things which are involved with updating the test as well, which become kind of time consuming, as I said. So what I'm going to do now is I'm actually going to hand over to Nathan, and he's going to show us some things here. Actually, Chris, could you do that for me? I can't seem to make my mouse want to behave right now.
No problem. Give me just 1 second.
Okay. So I think you've got it, Nathan.
Actually, can you switch to the other one, Chris?
My bad.
There we go.
Fantastic.
Okay, great. Thanks, Mark. So the first thing that I am going to show you is how the unit test assistant can get me up and running quickly with creating a test case, creating the basic framework for the test, adding the assertions, and creating the mocking code to isolate the class under test. Now, before I show you what the unit test assistant can do for me, I want to contrast that with what the facilities that the IDE gives me. So what I'm going to be working with today is this account class that I have open. It's part of a simple banking application that I'm working on. And the method that I want to create a test for today is the supply method. So if I was going to create a test using the IDE facilities, it might look something like this. We'll just go and create a JUnit test. It's going to create me an account test class. Let me choose apply. And what the IDE gives me is the framework for a test case. There's absolutely no logic in it. It fails by default. Frankly, in all of my development years, I've actually never even used this because it's so quick and easy to create this framework, myself. Just create a new class and start writing in it. So what the IDE gives me is really not that useful for me. I've never used it. So let me delete that, and let's look at what the unit test assistant can do. So first we'll call attention to, I have a unit test assistant view, and what you'll notice today as I'm clicking around and working with my code, you'll notice that this action bar highlights based on what I'm looking at in my code and the available actions to me from the unit test assistant. The first thing that we'll show is how I can quickly create a simple test case with one click. So let me just go ahead and do that. I'm going to create a regular test case, and we'll see that the unit test assistant set up the test class. I've got my test apply method. We'll see that the object that we're testing is instantiated. It's got some default values being passed into the constructor. We'll see that I have the method that I'm testing, the apply method, is being called, and the parameter passed into that is automatically mocked. Now, I previously had configured Unit Test Assistant to mock those kinds of parameters, which is why it created those mocks. And we'll see here that this method set up all the mocks for me. Now, what the Unit Test Assistant did in this case is it identified that there were two methods in this iTransaction object that get called when the apply method gets called. So it identified that those methods get called, and it automatically set up mocks for those. The thing that I want to highlight here is Unit Test Assistant is following a design paradigm that we're using, which is we're calling guided test creation. So it is creating the basic framework for the test. It's setting up the mocking code for me, and the initialization, but it's leaving me to fill out the logic. So put in the data values and so on, and to adjust the test to meet whatever test case that I'm trying to validate. Now, with the guided test creation, you'll notice that we have comments here. So everywhere that Unit Test Assistant used default values, it shows me that. So it reminds me these are places I need to go back and adjust. So let me do that now. When I click on the customer object, again, you'll notice that the actions bar updates. The two actions I want to focus on here, I could choose to instantiate this object, or I could choose to mock it. In this case, I want to mock it. So that I can isolate my account class, and you'll notice when I click that, the mock gets added for me. Let's say in this case, I'm testing my bank account, so I'm going to initialize the bank account to $1,000. Down in my mocks, I want to adjust the default values for those as well, so I'll update that to true. I know that that needs to return true. And for whenever there's a transaction, I want a $10 fee, so I'll do that. Okay, so now I have a basic test case. I've updated the parameters. Let's go ahead and run that. All right, so my test case is passing. There's one key thing that I'm missing in this test case at the moment, and that's I did not create any assertions yet. So what we'll notice is when the Unit Test Assistant runs test cases, we'll notice that it provides recommendations on various ways that I can improve my tests. And in this particular case, it detected that I have no assertions. The interesting thing here is the Unit Test Assistant will allow me to run this test and track what happens to the data values as it runs. So that's what happens when I use the track action. So I'm going to click this action here in the recommendation called track apply. So it runs the test, and as it does that, it detects some possible assertions that could be created in my test. So if we look here at the recommendation, we see that there's a balance field, and it detected that that field changed from the value of 1,000 to 990. That's for my $10 fee. It also noticed that my class has an account status field. No changes were made to the values, so it's but it's an assertion I could make validating the status. In the variables tab, I can see a little bit more details. So I can see the object that I'm testing. I can see those same fields, what the original values were, what the new values are. I actually can, from here, if I wanted to create individual assertions for individual fields, I can go ahead and do that from here. But I know that I want to create both of those assertions, so I'm going to switch back to recommendations. I'm just going to go ahead and click Make Assertions. and then we see the assertions get added. So I can run that now. And I have a passing test case with some good initial values, and I've got some assertions in it. So now this is a test case that tests the basic flow through this method. Now, another thing that I want to highlight is as I'm creating and running tests, coverage information is being collected. So I can see that over here on the right-hand side, I have this coverage tab. And I'm going to focus here on my account object. So the account object is the one that I've been creating a test for. I currently have 55% coverage in that class, which is a good start. I need to do better, but it's a good start. If I switch over to the source code for the class I'm testing, I have red and green markers to show me what I've covered. So I see here my apply method is fully covered. I can also see I have other methods like set balance that have not yet been covered. So this gives me a nice indication of, you know, in my test case, what parts of the classes I've covered and what I've not, so I can go back and add more test cases if I need to. So with that, what I've just shown you is how the unit test assistant, with a single click, I can create a basic test case, and then I can use the functionality to extend the test case to create the assertions, to adjust the default values in the mocks, and to create a unit test that tests the use cases that I'm looking for. I was able to create that test case quite quickly, especially for the mocking. That mocking code, if I had to write that by hand, would have taken me quite a lot longer to do.
Yeah, so that's really cool. So what we've got now is the ability to help you create those initial unit tests, focus on the business logic rather than all of the wiring, gives you guided direction as to what you need to do to set up the code so that you can get to the business logic. You've got integrated code coverage there. And then that tracking piece that we were showing is pretty key. Here what you're able to do is, as Nathan showed you, not only will UTA give you the recommendations on what should be asserted, but also gives you the ability to inspect what's going on within the internals of the objects that are being used without having to launch a debugger and start stepping through everything. But the second challenge that I talked about is a very real one. Okay, so this is great. I can create one meaningful test, and this is your goal. You want to create a meaningful test, not just a whole bunch of kind of garbage that you're going to have to maintain. You really want to have a focused set of tests. But how do I get started? How do I kind of get going, so to speak?
Right. So there are two key challenges, or two key cases, I would say, that this applies. So the first is oftentimes when I am creating a unit test for a method, there are parameters to that method. And in order to fully test that method, I need to run the test with a combination or a permutation of different parameters. And setting those things up is not always easy. So generally you would create a parameterized test case for that. So in a second, I'll show you how the unit test assistant can help me quickly create a parameterized test. The second key challenge would come from a situation where maybe I was a little bit of a bad boy. I didn't create the test that I should have created, but now I know better, and I think now I should create some. Unit Test Assistant can help me create tests in bulk using the same guided test creation parameters. So it will create the basic test cases for me, and then I can extend them with the business logic that I need to test. So let's take a look at how these work. So the first thing that I'll focus on is creating parameterized tests with Unit Test Assistant. And let's look at the set balance method that I don't have any tests for yet. We'll see that it takes a balance parameter, and depending on the values of the balance parameter, it adjusts the account status. So to create a method here, or create a test case, I'll click the Add Test Cases, and what I want to choose is to create parameterized tests. I'm going to choose to use permutation of five different permutations of parameters. I could choose to generate those parameters into the code or into an external CSV file. I'll go ahead and choose code. And then the unit test assistant allows me to choose whether I want to do deep initialization of all the dependent objects or do a more shallow initialization and go back and fill in what I need. So in this case, I'm going to do the deep initialization. This will give me the highest level of isolation of my code. And let me click OK. So what we see here is I actually have a parameterized test created. It's using the JUnit params test case format. And what's really nice about this, I mean, the thing that I personally like is I never remember how to write parameterized tests. What's the exact format? So we see that the structure of the test is set up with the format. I've got the account object is initialized, the method is called. I have an initial set of parameters. UTA has a set of parameters that it's chosen to try to cover some different permutations of values. Let me go ahead and run this test. And we'll see the ran with all the different parameters. Let's switch back to the class. And if I look at the set balance method, I look at the coverage markers, I see it happened to cover one of the branches, but two of the other branches didn't get covered. So this is where the parameterized test is really nicely, or works really well. I want to pass in a different set of balances. Oops, I want to cover these cases. So I know from my class that there's different cutoffs for the statuses. One of them is under $5,000, so I'll make that. Actually, I think it's under 500, so I'll make that 100 there. And then the next cutoff is 10,000, so I need this to be somewhere in the middle, so I'll just pick 5,000, maybe 7,500 is better. And then I'll do something over 10,000, so let's do 11,000. All right, so I adjust the parameters there. I can run this test again. It ran with the updated set of parameters. Now if I switch and I look at the method that I tested, now I see that I have complete coverage of this method. So again, this is how the unit test assistant can help me quickly create a parameterized test, and I can simply update the parameters to cover the different cases that I need, and that was quite quick and easy for me to set that up. Now the second problem that I mentioned was, let's say that I have in my code base, I did not create a lot of unit tests, and now I know I need to, but I'm also worried about how much time it will take me to create all those tests. Unit Test Assistant will allow me to create tests for an entire project or an entire package at one time. So what I'll do is I'll look at this package, that's my bank project, and I am going to choose to add test cases for that. And what I'm going to do here is, instead of choosing parameterized, I'm going to choose the combined option. What this is going to allow me to do is, for any test methods that take no parameters, it's going to create a regular test case. For any methods that take parameters, it will create a parameterized test case. This combination will give me the highest coverage of test cases created. It'll cover the most code. So we'll choose combined, and I'll click OK. And we'll notice here that I've got some tests being created over here on the left, and so it created 41 test cases for me. Now I can look at one of these tests. Basically, these are the same kinds of test cases that I've already shown you. The parameters are initialized with mocks and default values. These tests are now ready for me to go back and adjust the logic to fit the particular cases that I want to cover. But you'll notice that, in just a matter of a few seconds, I created something like 10, 15 test classes. So that gave me a significant jump start on creation of those tests. Now, I'm going to go ahead and run them. Any of the test cases that are created by the Unit Test Assistant are runnable on their own, outside of any Parasoft infrastructure or technology. So I could run them in CI builds, I could run them anywhere I want, and with no dependence on Parasoft. So let me go ahead and run them just as normal JUnit tests. And as I would expect, I've got some passing and failing. I need to go back and update the values. Now, if I look at my coverage, I'll just look at the account class because that's the class we've been focused on so far. You'll actually see that I'm now up to 100% coverage with all the tests I've created. So I got 100% coverage in a very short amount of time. Obviously, some of those tests, I still need to go back and adjust some assertions and some parameters, but this got me up and running quite quickly. So as I've just shown you, the unit test assistant can help me create both parameterized tests and get a jump start on creating tests for projects that I might not have a lot of tests for quite quickly and easily. It saves me a lot of time.
Yeah, and I think a couple of the key things that you brought up there. The bulk creation really does give you a jump start. Obviously, the account class we got to 100%. We would need to clean up the test, but I don't know if other folks noticed, it was actually 61% on the MBank package itself. So really, for all those folks that said, 40% and below, there's something here which will help you get, to the next step. Now, obviously, not all of the tests were passing, so we would want to go ahead and do some kind of final cleanup there, but that's key. The other thing which is really kind of important as well is these are regular JUnits. So yes, Nathan's running them as, under the unit test assistant and under JTest so that we can get this kind of deeper analysis that we'll talk about a little bit more next, actually. But all of these tests could be run using standard JUnit runner as part of your CI infrastructure, leveraging additional code coverage tools if you've already got something already plugged into your infrastructure doing that. So there really is complete flexibility and openness on these tests that are created. So they're leveraging JUnit, and you can also see Mockito there as some of the mocking frameworks. Now, let's talk about the third challenge, though, and this is where it starts to get interesting because you're now going to start discovering another problem. So your first problem with unit testing is just getting going. Right, it's and getting past, it's the going to the gym when you just know you need to get out of bed to go. But then you've got the longer term problem here is that maintaining those tests is also going to take time. And as you evolve and change the code, you're also going to have to evolve and change the tests. And I know, Nathan, that's something you've talked to me specifically about as we were implementing functionality into UTA. So why don't you go ahead and talk about some of those challenges?
Right. So I would say that there are three key challenges that my teams have faced as we've been building and maintaining unit test suites. One of the hardest ones to deal with is unstable test environments. Now, what this means in the context of unit tests, often what can happen is I can have one unit test that changes some global parameter in my environment. Could be a static variable that got changed or some system property that got changed. And I have tests further on down the line in that test run that depend on the value of that property. So the first test changes the value and it affects the outcome of the second test, even though those tests really should be independent of each other. What we found is debugging those problems can be incredibly difficult. So what ends up happening is the test fails in the nightly test run. I go to my desktop, I run it, it passes. Okay, what's wrong? And it ends up being something where you have to go on the test machine to try to debug the problem, or you have to start running all of the unit tests in your local environment, which, if you have a lot of them, can take a long time. So narrowing down which test could be causing the instability can be very, very difficult. So I'll show you in a minute how the unit test assistant can help identify some of those kinds of problems. The second, or the next two issues, both are related to evolving tests as the application changes. So in the first case, let's say that I have built my application, I've actually written some unit tests for it, and I've created mocks as part of those test cases. So I'm using Mockito and mocked out some of the dependencies. Now what we find often happens in our development is we change the behavior of the application. Maybe it's calling some new methods because I added some functionality. And now my tests start failing, and they're failing because I need to update the mocks. Maybe one of the mocked objects, there might be a new method being called in that object, and I don't have any mocks set up for it yet, so it's not behaving properly in my test environment. That happens to us, frankly, it happens all the time. And fixing that, trying to update the test to solve that problem can be difficult because oftentimes I have to go see, okay, why is it failing? I might need to run it through the debugger. Okay, where is it failing? Oh, okay, that's calling that object. Oh, yeah, that's not mocked. That can take a while to figure that out. So in a minute here, I'll show you how the unit test assistant can help find those kinds of things quickly for me, so I don't have to spend as much time on that. And then the last problem, also dealing with my application changes. So let's say I've created some tests. I have assertions in those tests. They're valid at the point when I created the tests. Now I change my application, so the expected behavior is different, and the unit test starts failing. Now it's not failing because the application is broken. It's failing because the expectations for how it should behave have changed. So I need to go ahead and update that assertion. Now there are some cases where that's simple. You just can update the assertion. But what we found is there are many cases where those values that are being asserted are actually quite complex. And so trying to figure out what are the right values and updating the test case with those can be somewhat time consuming. So let me show you how the unit test assistant helps with all these problems. So I had run this set of tests that we created. Let's switch. So you'll see in the recommendations view, there's some different categories of different kinds of findings that it found. So let me look at the unstable test environment. So the first recommendation says that a system property got set during the test run. And we already know that system properties are a problem if I update them during a test run because those are global values. So I can click here in this go to action. It'll take me directly to the code so I can see the place in the code where the property is being set. Okay, that's interesting. The other thing that I can do is I can click this highlight. And what you'll see is as tests are running, the unit test assistant is gathering information about the flow of the code as the test was being run. So we'll see here, I can actually see where the test method got called and then the various methods that got called up until the point where set property was called. So this gives me information about what happened without me having to step through a debugger, which is really, really nice. So now, at this point, now that I understand that I have the system property being set, the thing that I would do is in my test case, I would need to go back and finally block and set it back to its normal default state. So the unit test assistant handles a number of different cases that we have identified, things like setting system properties or setting static variables. Creating files on disk can cause those same kinds of problems. So the unit test assistant looks for a number of those things and will report those to you. So you can see how this allows me to quite quickly find these issues without having to do complex debugging with my whole suite of tests. Okay, now the second problem that I mentioned is, let's say that my test case is failing because I need to update some of my mocking code. So in the recommendations view, I'll switch over here to mocking. We'll see here that I have a test case in this run. It says that I have a possibly mockable call. So let me click go to. Let's look at what we've got. So I have a parameterized test here. We'll see that I am mocking the account object. We can also see that I've mocked the getBalance method in that object. Okay, that's good. But we'll see that the recommendation is telling me that setBalance got called and there's no mock created for it. I can click highlight and this will show me the flow, and I can actually see if I click here, this is where the setBalance method actually got called as the test was being run. So okay, great. Now I know I need to create a mock for setBalance. So what I'll do here is I'll come over here and I'll click the mock it action. This will jump me back to my test case, and you'll see that it now added this new block of code for the setBalance method. Again, it's using default values, so it allows me to customize what the behavior should be of this mock, but it created the mock for me quite quickly, quite easily. If I had to write this by hand, usually, again, I don't remember how to do that, so that would have taken me a couple minutes to look up the docs and figure out what to do. All right, the third case is that I want to show you is what happens when I change the behavior of my application and I need to update my assertions to reflect that. So let's go back and look at my account object. Now we were looking at the status, and there's different cutoffs for what status you get for different account balances. So if I come up here, I've got some variables that set that. So let's say I've got, right now it's set that $500 or more gives me the gold status. So I'm going to increase it to 5,000. That's, want to change that logic in my application. Let me go ahead and rerun my test. Okay, so my test apply method is failing. This is what I would expect. This is the assertion that's failing. It's asserting gold status, but actually now, based on the logic change that I made, I'm expecting silver status. So this is quite easy for me to update now with the unit test assistant. I can just click the update assertion button, and now it's updated to silver. Now, this value is very simple. I could have easily done that by hand, but there are many, many cases that I've run into in the past where the string is long and complicated. What often could happen is I could have the assertion failure or the updated value in my assertion failure, but it's hard to copy and paste it from my IDE into my code, and so I end up having to type it. So it's just kind of a pain. So this allows me to quickly update the assertions. Okay, so with that, I've shown you how the unit test assistant can handle a number of different problems or a number of different, basically, time sinks that happen when I'm maintaining my tests.
Yeah, so the runtime analysis helps us with those unstable test environments things, and I think that, for me, that was kind of an eye-opener when we were developing this functionality, is that one of our other development teams actually uncovered a problem related to test instability that they weren't able to identify previously. It was just some unit tests were kind of somewhat behaving badly, and it was never easy to diagnose. And I think that one was actually a threads-related issue. So, as well as the properties and what have you, we can capture those threads. So, and this is a unit testing best practice that a lot of people kind of don't think about properly, is that yes, the test should be isolated from its external dependencies, but it should be also isolated within itself so that you can run it as in true isolation. I've got one test failing and I can run that individual test. Now, obviously, that's not going to always be the case. Sometimes you're going to have suites that are running concert with each other. But being able to identify those hidden dependencies is often very valuable to be able to uncover those issues. The other thing that I was just thinking as you showed the assertions at the end is, not only does UTA give you the ability to quickly refactor the code with the assertion, but also from there your unit test assistant action bar has actually the track options too. So I could say, okay, I see that the assertions change. Let me go ahead and run track. And I could run track at any particular point within that test and then use the variables view to see, okay, what's going on inside of it, making it easier than having to run through a debugger. Obviously, you could run it through a debugger. It's a regular JUnit, but giving you kind of that quick access and easy access to that. Now, everything that we've shown so far has been a pretty straightforward test, though, or a pretty straightforward code, plain Java objects. And UTA was designed so that it could address, the generic Java stuff. But we've also added some enhancements to UTA to specifically focus on Spring. So let's go ahead and do another poll. And what I'd like to get here is kind of some feedback on the test cases that folks are creating. So can we go ahead and start the poll, Chris? Perfect, thank you. So what we're asking here is for those folks that are using Spring as the MVC framework, where do you see your challenges, and what types of application are you developing? Obviously, not everybody is developing Spring. Although Spring has certainly become, in my opinion, the default standard for web-based applications, especially when you're creating HTTP endpoints, for example. If you're not using Spring, but you're using something else, like struts, for example, go ahead and click other MVC framework. That'll be interesting for us to know as we're going through today's session. If you're not doing any kind of MVC, if you're not creating a web application, go ahead and click on the I'm not using MVC at all. How are we doing there, Chris?
Just about done. We'll give people a few more seconds here to get their answers in, and then we can go ahead and close the poll. Great.
There is actually one item there, which is the Spring Web Reactive stuff, and obviously that's new in Spring 5. So again, this will be interesting data for us because it'll help us from the point of view of understanding kind of what the community is using. Certainly, we've not seen too much of an uptake of that from the folks that we've been communicating with, but certainly it'll be an interesting data point. Great stuff. Okay. So looks like we've got quite a few folks not using an MVC framework at all. That's really interesting for us. Certainly what we're going to talk about next obviously won't apply to you guys because you're not using Spring, but it'll be interesting to show you kind of the sophistication that we've got in there. If you're not using an MVC framework, everything that we've already shown you fully applies to your current development practices, obviously. Spring WebMVC and Spring Boot are certainly the two key areas that we'd actually identified where organizations are having challenges with Spring. So that's a good data point for us because the great news is that's exactly what we focused on in Unit Test Assistant, so that further validates it. Other MVC frameworks, okay, so I'm presuming that's probably things like struts and what have you. And that you're frantically making sure that you've applied the security patches and you don't end up being like Equifax. And then it's also interesting about the Spring 5. So Spring 5 is going to be something we're going to be looking into for the next release of UTA. So probably that would be great. So when we kind of do the call to actions and the follow-ups after this, if Spring Web Reactive is a challenge for you, please kind of let us know that, and we'll talk to you kind of a little bit more one-on-one on those. So let's go ahead and end the poll, and let's switch to actually showing how we could create Spring test cases specifically on WebMVC code, which is exposing HTTP endpoints. We do have Spring Boot support as well, but obviously we can't show absolutely everything in a 1-hour webinar. So Nathan, let's go ahead and look at the Spring stuff.
Okay, so let me pull up a Spring controller class. So this is a controller for a different banking application that I have. This is my login controller class, and this class handles all the login functionality for my application. So we'll see, this method is obviously a bit more complex than some of the ones we've been looking at. So even if you're not developing with Spring, this will show you the power of UTA in these kinds of cases. Okay, so the first thing that I'm going to go ahead and do is, again, for Spring test cases, I can do one-click test creation. So I'll click Add Spring Test Cases. I want to do only for handler methods. This class only has a single handler method, so I'll just go ahead and click OK. Okay, great. So I have my login controller test. Now, unit tests in Spring are quite a bit more complicated than the normal JUnits. There's a lot of boilerplate code that is needed to set up the framework. Spring has a nice unit testing framework built into it, so we are leveraging that. So we're using things like the mock HTTP session, the mock MVC framework from Spring. So we automatically set that up in the test case. You'll notice also that if there are any dependent beans from my controller, the test case sets up methods that create those beans. By default, I'm mocking those right now based on my settings. And this allows me to go in and customize the behavior of those beans for the test case that I'm creating. Lastly, we'll see that I have the test method for the handler method that I'm testing. It has set up and it makes the mock MVC.perform call, which is how you invoke a Spring handler method in a unit test. It has configured the request string that is needed to invoke that handler method. And again, we're using the guided test creation paradigm, so I have some variables with default values, but the unit test assistant is showing me what those are so I can update them. So in this case, I know I want to test a case with a username and password, so I'm just going to go ahead and add those in there. I can remove the comments to remind myself I'm done with that. We'll also see that it created me some default assertions that I could uncomment and use. For now, one of the common things in a web application that I would want to validate is as it gives me an HTTP 200 status, so I'm going to uncomment that assertion. Today, I'm not too interested in the other one, so I'm just going to delete those. So this is my basic test case. Let me go ahead and run that. So it's launching it using the Spring framework. It'll run the test. Again, this is a completely independent JUnit that can run in any environment you wish. All right, so it ran, it passed. So it's a basic test case that runs. Now, if I look at the coverage markers, can see what happens. We'll see that I've made it down to this section in my code, but I actually ended up in an error condition. So my access mode controller.login method call is returning a null customer object. This is not the case that I wanted to test. I wanted to test more of the happy path through the code. So I need to update my test case to return me a real customer object. Now we'll notice if I look at the recommendations view in Unit Test Assistant that I've got a recommendation for a possibly mockable method call for that exact login method, which is really nice. So if I click Go To, I can jump to the place where access mode controller was mocked. And I want to actually add in a mock for that method call, so I'll click the mock it action, and you'll see that the code got updated. I'm still mocking the class, but now I'm also mocking the login method. Customer object is defaulted to null. I don't want that. In this case, I'll instantiate it. So I'll click the instantiate action, instantiates the object for me. So now this should give me a better result in my test case. So let me try that and run the test again. Okay, great. Okay, so I have a failure. I'll come back to that in a moment. If I look back at the coverage markers, I'll see now that I got past that block of code. I now have a non-null customer object, and I actually ended up in the last return statement. So this tests one of the paths through my code that I wanted to test. Now we'll notice that I'm returning a redirect view. This is a Spring object that basically says to return a redirect. So the initial assertion, I was assuming it should return a 200. That's actually not what it was supposed to be returning. It's supposed to be returning a redirect. And we can see that in the assertion failure. So it expected 200, but I got a 302. I can jump back to the code. Here's the assertion that needs to be updated. Unit Test Assistant gives me some actions that allow me to update it. So in this case, let's say, well, no, I want to expect 302 instead. So I click the action. I see that the test case gets automatically updated. And now if I go ahead and run that, the test case will pass. So now I have a basic functioning test case with some initial parameters, executes the case through the code that I wanted, and we see it's passing. So with this, I've shown you a really quick scenario how I can quickly create a Spring test case and update it to cover the logic that I care about. If I had to do this by hand, especially all that boilerplate code, the Spring boilerplate code, that would have taken me a long time to write by hand. So you see how I was able to do that, maybe, what was that, 5 minutes? So it's quite easy for me.
Okay, so we ran through all of the same capabilities. So hopefully what you're seeing here is that really the support for Spring is taking the core functionality of UTA and kind of giving it an injection of steroids so that it can start kind of handling some of the Spring workflows and Spring use cases. All of this core functionality is available for, as I said, both POJOs and Spring. and it's pretty powerful. I hope you agree. Now we're going to switch to questions in a moment, so go ahead and start putting your questions into the questions panel. But I'm going to run one last poll, and we're going to keep this one relatively short. So go ahead and launch the poll, please, Chris. So as we evolve UTA, we're aggressively keeping in step with the new frameworks and what have you. So obviously Java 9 has just come out, JUnit 5 has been out for a little bit now, and we are working to implement that functionality into the coming release of UTA. So what I would like to do is just get a little bit of feedback from you guys, and I think the poll is set up as one of the following, which it probably should have been set up as multiples, but that's okay. Just select the one that's most important to you. If you don't plan on using either JUnit 5 or Java 9 in the next 12 months, just ignore it, don't submit the poll, but go ahead and submit your questions. So this will give us a little bit of an idea as to kind of where to focus the product as we move forward. One of the things that we're hyper-focused on at Parasoft is making sure that we work closely with our customers. So we're going to be wanting to hear a lot of feedback, a lot of input on the product. And we'll be actually at Java 1 next week, where both Nathan and I will actually be there. So it would be great to meet with some folks if you guys are also coming there. So how are we doing, Chris?
Doing pretty good. We'll give people just a couple more seconds here to get their answers in, and then we can close the poll. Great.
So, and then what we'll do is after this, we'll switch straight into questions, kind of for the couple of minutes that we have left. We can kind of run a little longer if we need to, no problem at all. Okay. Cool. So that's kind of interesting. So it does tell us that Java 9, which is what we think, we're currently in the process of actually wrapping up our research on that. And we actually had determined that Java 9 was a little bit more important than JUnit 5, and this is kind of validating that for me. We will be adding support for both Java 9 and JUnit 5 into UTA, but this actually validates the priority order that we were probably going to attack it in actually. So let's go ahead and close the poll. And let's go ahead and kind of get to our last slide of the day. So before we go into questions, a couple of things. First of all, if you go to the Parasoft homepage, you'll see this rather cool little graphic. This will link you directly to the blog that we've written about Unit Test Assistant. Touches upon a number of the things we've talked about today. You can also request a demo and get an evaluation of Unit Test Assistant start playing in your environment. And as I said earlier, both Nathan and I are going to be at Java 1 next week. Next week is when we're going to be actually releasing the 10.3.3 version of JTest that has all of the Unit Test Assistant functionality that Nathan's just talked about. So that'll be actually up and live on our download servers for existing customers on Monday next week. So with that being said, Chris, let's go ahead and switch to questions and see if we can get a few before we kind of run out of everybody's time.
Yeah, sounds good. Looks like we've got a few that have come in so far. So first one we've got is wanting to know if you guys offer support for PowerMock.
Yeah, actually, great question. So yes, we do have support for PowerMock in Unit Test Assistant. Actually, that's one of the things that we got feedback on. It's actually going into the release on Monday. Nathan, do you want to talk about the use cases for using PowerMock?
Right, so there was two key use cases that we focused on. The main one was the ability to mock static methods. That's a very common thing that needs to get stubbed out when you're creating test cases. And then the second one is mocking constructor calls. So and there's some cases where that allows you to better isolate the class that you're testing if you can mock out constructor calls for other objects. So those are the two key cases that we're currently supporting with PowerMock.
Yeah, and there's actually a cool piece of functionality within that kind of trace tree view that that Nathan was showing us earlier when he did the focus. You can select static methods directly from there and say, okay, in the future I want to mock this one out, or I want to put a mock in that in the test that was actually reported on. So yeah, fully supported.
Great. All right, next question. Can I run these tests as part of my CI and send results to Sonar?
Yes. So as we said earlier, these are regular JUnits, so you can execute them as part of your regular CI infrastructure, sending the results to SonarQube. We do have a framework, which is a reporting and analytics dashboard within the Parasoft solution as well. So if you actually to execute the unit tests using JTest on the server, we can also consume those results into the Parasoft reporting platform. Not going to go into that into great detail today. Kind of one of the key differentiating pieces there is the level of granularity that we can work with on that coverage data inside of DTP, which is our reporting and analytics platform. We've actually done webinars on that in the past, and in fact our website is going to be undergoing a big revamp in October, and you'll see a number of things kind of talking about that promotion. But certainly, yes, it integrates into your existing Sonar workflows, and you can also get an additional value add by executing the tests and sending that data to DTP as well.
Great. Next question from Jacob. Seems like this tool can help with some legacy code, code with no tests, but what about test-driven development? Can it somehow help with TDD?
That's a great one, and actually that's I'm kind of Nathan and I are smirking at each other right now because that's a question that comes up quite a bit, is around test-driven development. Do you want me to go first, or you want to go first on this?
I can go first. So one of the key places where I've done test-driven development in the past is I have some existing code, but I need to add additional behavior to it, or maybe I need to fix a bug in it. So in those cases, what I would do is I would write the test case first. It's a failing test case, and then I write the code to make it pass, right? That's the classic test-driven development paradigm. So the unit test assistant can help me make that easy, because I've got some, existing code, and the workflows that I showed will work to create a test case that I can then adjust as I needed to test my case, and then I can go back and develop my code to satisfy that test case.
Yeah, and I think that it's interesting. I was reading an article on TDD, and I forget the lady's name that wrote it, but it was talking about there were these. It was the race car katas. I remember that was the name of the exercise. And it was all about exactly what you just said, Nathan, which was, okay, when you're doing test-driven development, you're often doing it to try and help you evolve existing functionality. So using UTA to create those tests is obviously a strong piece. I can actually think of two other things as well that come in under the TDD conversation. The first is within JTest itself. So we've been focusing today on the unit test assistant and what we can do specifically around unit tests. JTest also has a very powerful code analysis engine embedded within it, and we have a number of static analysis rules which help you with unit test creation. In fact, there's two test configurations. One which is orientated around the TDD best practices of code smells, and then the other one is actually unit testing best practices that we use at Parasoft. So there's code analysis that you can do that helps with TDD, and then kind of taking things away from unit testing. We also have with SOA test, which is our API testing technology, and Virtualize, which is our service virtualization technology for emulating back-end endpoints, actually allows you to do a TDD-like centric process where you can create an emulation of the API, develop the tests against that, and then those tests will break, and you obviously start implementing the real functionality in replace of those APIs. The challenge always is with new code is that you don't have something to construct a test against, and that's the one area that I think API testing can help a little bit. So hopefully that wasn't that was helpful, and that kind of answered the question. If it didn't, please feel free to ask a follow-up question as we wrap up here. So do we have any more, Chris?
Yeah, I think we've got just a couple more here. So Andre first started off by saying this is awesome, and he would like to know, says that we are running Maven and Jenkins. Does he have to change anything in his infrastructure to utilize UTA?
So to utilize the test cases that UTA generates, the short answer to that question is no. There are a number of, obviously, jar files that we're using for, because we're using Mockito, we're using JUnit, we're using the params library as well.
JUnit params,
PowerMock. So those jar files would need to be added to your Maven POM file. There's actually a kind of like a little helper that lets you get past that first step within, when you're working directly within the IDE right there. We've actually got an option you might have noticed. It says Add UTA Library. That'll actually add it to your Eclipse workspace though. So if you're using Maven, then you'll want to add the jar files into your Maven POM. The tests are just regular JUnit, so you can run them as part of your CI. If you wanted to run JTest's coverage engine, then you would basically inject the JTest command line runner into your execution flow as well, but that's certainly an optional piece. I can't think of anything else. Can you, Nathan?
No, they're straightforward to run and execute. So.
Okay, great. Next question, do you guys offer support for IntelliJ?
Not yet. So we have Eclipse support, obviously, that you saw, and we support the latest version of Eclipse Oxygen. IntelliJ support for Unit Test Assistant is coming. That'll be coming in the early part of next year. However, what I'll reinforce is the thing that we've said a couple of times now, which is these are regular JUnits. So you can create the tests in Eclipse and kind of do those workflows in Eclipse, and then those JUnits can be just executed within IntelliJ seamlessly. As I said, though, we will be adding support for IntelliJ in the early part of next year.
Awesome. Next question, what is change-based testing?
Somebody was paying attention to one of my first slides. Okay, so change-based testing is one of the analytics that we can do with our overall ecosystem, where we can identify what tests need to be executed based upon changes in the code base. And we can do that for up and down the testing pyramid. That's where I was talking about it. So we can actually help you identify, for example, manual tests that need to be executed during the course of a sprint due to changes in the code base. Because obviously, as you're working within a sprint, you're often focused on that functionality rather than focused on the bigger picture, more holistic functionality of the entire application. So change-based testing helps you focus on that. There is another term that's kind of getting traction in the industry called test impact analysis. It's very, very similar. Test impact analysis is more focused on the developer workflows and kind of early stage unit tests. And as a little bit of a tease, Unit Test Assistant will be actually getting a little bit of the change-based testing work later this year, going into the early part of next year as well. But the change-based testing is typically focused, as I said, at trying to help you identify the subset of tests that need to be executed, be them unit, automated, functional, or manual tests, so that you can validate changes in the code base. And we typically focus on changes within the sprint, but it's actually more abstract than that. You can look at any two builds in your build process.
Great. We got just a couple of questions left here. Next one from Eric would like to know, what version of JTest are you running for the presentation today?
Okay, so the version of JTest that we're running today is actually the release candidate for 10.3.3. That release will drop on Monday. We're just in kind of the final stages of kind of polishing and making sure that everything is passing our regressions. The current GA version of JTest is 10.3.2. And if you're an existing user and you can't wait until Monday, if you look on the customer portal, there's actually a milestone 5 release of 10.3.3. So what we actually did, and we'll be continuing to do this, is making pre-releases available through our customer portal so you can kind of get the latest and greatest.
All right, I think we've got the last question here, and it's a good one. So how much does it cost?
How much does it cost? Okay, so the easy answer to that question is talk to a sales guy or request more information. So JTest is actually available a number of different ways. So we actually have perpetual and subscription license models. We've got node locked and floating licenses, and we also have different scales of packs depending on kind of the size of the deployment. So there really isn't a simple dollar figure answer. So what I would say is click on the request to demo, go to the website, contact info@parasoft.com, and the sales team will be able to more than happy more than happily help you answer that question and figure out what's the most applicable deployment model within your organization.
Great. Well, it looks like that's all the questions that we have for today. Mark and Nathan, anything else that you'd like to add here before we close things up?
I think the only thing I'd like to say is thank you very much for the time. We've got a lot of people that stayed past the hour. I really appreciate the time. As I said, we're going to be at Java 1 next week. We love meeting people, or at least I do. Nathan's not so sure he likes leading development.
I know, it's fun for me.
Yeah, so we definitely want to hear questions. We would like to interact with people in person, so please come by the booth next week.
Great. Well, I'd just like to thank Mark and Nathan for a great presentation today. Also want to thank our sponsor, Parasoft, for providing the DZone audience with another great webinar presentation. Lastly, thank you to everybody who joined us for today's webinar. We hope you learned something new today that will help you in your developer career. Have a great day, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks, everybody.